Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I am so thrilled that you could be here with us tonight. My name is Sam Anderson. I'm a regional teacher trainer for C2 Education, and I have been working with students for almost 10 years, working primarily SAT, ACT, helping a lot of them with the exact question that we're going to be tackling today, right? SAT or the ACT, which test should you take? What test is better for you? What are the differences? We're really going to sort of take a look through a couple particular areas, right? We're going to look through the general test information, a bit about, sort of each of the tests, sort of side-by-side comparison. Then we're going to sort of take a look and go deeper and deeper into each subject. We're going to look at each of the individual sections, what they are about, and really, sort of take a look at the real differences between the two tests in math and reading and writing, and even in science, as well as the essay. And then, of course, we're going to get to the big question, right? Which test is better for you? We'll sort of take a look through that, what really goes into that, and really the sort of key parts that you should be looking at to decide. So just sort of start with, right? Let's go through some of the basics of the differences of the test, right? So when the SAT was redesigned, they sort of redesigned it with one very particular idea, right? It was designed to be in line with the skills that were needed for sort of the college and when students got out of college and started looking for a career. On the ACT, though, the ACT is aligned a little bit more into what's taught in school, right? It's much more of a review of sort of the material and topics taught in school. That being said, they are, equally acceptable to colleges, but one is, geared much more forward versus one is much more of a review of what's been going on over the last, 3, 4 years of school. Now, the SAT is obviously scored at 1600 with a sum of 2. ACT is an average of 4 and is scored from a 1 to a 36. SAT from 400 to 1600. For the subject, it's 200 to 800 for math, and the SAT 200 to 800 for reading and writing combined, the evidence-based reading and writing. ACT, each of the 4 sections, math, English, reading, and science, are scored from 1 to 36. And then they again take the average of all those and determine what your final score is. Now, both tests have an optional essay. The optional essay is scored slightly differently. So for the SAT, you get 3 scores, go each of them, reading, analysis, and writing going from 2 to an 8, versus the ACT is 1 overall score going from 2 to 12. Neither test have any kind of guessing penalty. What that means is that for every question you get right, you gain a point. For every question you get wrong or that you skip, you gain nothing. You don't lose anything, you just gain points when you get questions right. Now, the real sort of differences between the two tests are really in sort of the content focuses. The SAT really sort of, especially you'll see this in math, takes fewer of the concepts, right? It doesn't go quite as broad, right? There's no science section, but that, that's sort of a misnomer. We're going to talk a bit more about that later. There's, fewer concepts, but they're much more in depth in terms of how they look at them, right? They more problem solving, more critical thinking, less sort of, just doing the work really quickly. But that's really what the ACT. The ACT is, covers a bit broader, right? There's more geometry and math, etc. We'll again talk about that more later on. But overall, the questions are less intense, less, not necessarily less difficult, but less complex. The math problems maybe require a few less steps to be solved. And therefore, right, the SAT is much more aligned with analysis, critical thinking, versus the ACT is very straightforward, but, and this is key, and I cannot stress this enough, it is faster. It is a far faster test. So let's actually take a look at what I'm talking about here. So the SAT for math, overall, you have 2 math sections that for a total of 80 minutes, versus in the ACT, you have 1 math section for a total of 60 minutes. Reading, 65 minutes for reading versus 35 for ACT, right? So you can see there's a lot more time on the SAT for reading than there is on the ACT. Writing, while there seems to be less time on the SAT, 35 minutes compared to 45 minutes, we'll talk a bit more about that in a little while. Science, again, 35 minutes for the ACT. There is no science section in the SAT, but science is tested, or the scientific material is tested in other ways. Now, the essay, again, you have more time on the SAT than on the ACT. Overall, they're about the same length and test out, right? So without the essay, the SAT runs 3 hours flat, 180 minutes. With the essay, obviously, you add another 50 minutes to that. The ACT, on the other hand, runs just slightly short of the 3 hours, 175 minutes, or 2 hours and 55 minutes long. But, so it's not like one test is shorter than the other per se, but the way in which the timing works is very different. Now, especially that comes into case when you look at the amount of questions in that time. The SAT, overall, right? The SAT, 80 minutes for math. Overall, 57 questions versus the ACT has 60 questions in those 60 minutes. So as you can see, the ACT is a lot faster. The SAT, 5 passages of reading, 52 questions versus the ACT, 4 passages of reading in 40 questions. Remember, the ACT had almost half as much time on that reading section as the SAT did. So you can really get a sense that there is a lot more fast-paced work on the ACT. Now, writing, right? Yes, it was a shorter SAT section, but that's also because there are far, far fewer questions, right? 31 less questions on the SAT than on the ACT. And that really makes a difference, especially when there's only a 10-minute difference in the time between it. And for science, similar to the ACT reading, there are 40 questions in those 35 minutes. Now, the essay, right, there's one prompt for each one, and we're going to look through a bit more about, what the differences are in that prompt in a little while. Now, as I was sort of talking about before, there is vast differences in the amount of time per questions, right? Depending on the part, almost unilaterally, every single one, there is more time on the SAT than on the ACT, right? 75 questions for the non-calculator part per question versus 60 questions on the ACT, right? And on part 2 with the calculator, there's even more time. Reading, 13 minutes per passage versus a little bit under 9 minutes. Writing, right? It seems to flip around in terms of passages, but if you look at the questions, right, how much time you get per question, you get barely more than half a minute per question for the ACT, right? That's like nothing. That's a blip. I've been talking for many, many more of those so already versus the SAT, right? A little bit more, right? 25% more time, and that's sort of standard. And there's about 25% more time on the SAT per question than there is on the ACT, right? 25% more time per question. That's standard. That's across the board. Some sections, like reading, like the second part of math, are even more. But overall, there is noticeably more time per question on the SAT than on the ACT. So if you struggle with pacing, that might be something to think about. So, right, because of that, the first question isn't so much which one should you take, but really which one do you prefer, right? So the SAT, you've got more time to solve each question, but because of that, and because they give you that extra time, they're really a lot more in depth. They require much more careful thinking, critical thinking, more steps. Sometimes the questions connect to each other, and we'll talk about that in a little while. That's for the SAT. The ACT, right, is a little bit faster. So if you tend to second guess yourself, if you tend to perform really well under time conditions, that might be good for you, right? Because there's less time to solve, but the questions are simpler, more straightforward, and therefore much easier to tackle in that rapid succession. If you are someone who, really likes that pacing and really can keep going, the ACT, might be a bit of a preference. Now, preference we're talking here, not necessarily better for you. We'll talk about that in a bit. But let's first take a look. Really, let's go deeper into each section. Let's go deeper into each subject. We're going to start with math, right? The sort of one of the bigger differences between the two. Now, as a sort of overview, right, the SAT puts a lot more emphasis on multi-step problem solving, right? Again, a lot of times these questions have 3, 4, sometimes even 5 steps from the question to the answer. Versus the ACT, a lot simpler, maybe 2, 3 steps, and much more computation. You can use the calculator on the entire test versus you can only use it on the second session, the half of that math test on the SAT. Now, one of the sort of things to sort of think about when it comes to this is the ACT does have a stronger focus on geometry, but there is technically geometry on both. In the SAT, the geometry sometimes is a little bit more conceptual and reasoning based versus the ACT, you're going to get flat out area problems and line angle problems versus the SAT is still, a lot of times a bit more algebra focused, but there is still geometry, right? Now, One of the big ones, the ones that really sort of get a lot of students, is that the SAT does have topic skills questions going all the way from pre-algebra all the way up to some early pre-calculus, versus the ACT only goes up to Algebra 2 with some trig questions. So that is, again, a noticeable difference. Now that means your math track, the track that you were on in school for math, can make a difference. It shouldn't be the be-all, end-all, but it can make a big difference when it comes to this test and deciding between the two. So again, for the non-calculator section, right, there's 75 questions, calculator 89. Overall, right, it is fewer questions and more time, right? But the ACT is rigorous in the pacing. A lot of students really struggle. A lot of my students, it is one of the big challenges when it comes to the ACT. They're doing really good for the first chunk. Then they hit like that question 30 or question 40 in the ACT and they realize, oh my God, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to do the rest of these. And they start panicking. So it requires rigorous pacing. It requires making sure that you are good with that pacing and that you can pace yourself well. And it's important to understand pacing. When we talk about pacing, pacing goes either way, right? It doesn't mean just necessarily running out of time, but it could also mean rushing, right? A lot of students have pacing problems, not because they run out of time, but because they're going too fast and they're not spending enough time on the question. So you have to understand that for the ACT, pacing goes both ways. Just because you finish the test really fast doesn't mean you put your best foot forward. So really keep that in mind, that you're going to need to practice your pacing for the ACT, you know, rigorously, because it's going to require pacing that you're not rushing because you're keeping the time in mind, and that you're not going too slowly. Now, in terms of the math, right, we sort of talked about this, right? SAT is pre-calculus, ACT, Algebra 2 trig, you know, fewer topics, more in depth, more topics, a lot less in depth, and again, now, reading is different, right? Math is kind of straightforward, right? More problems, shorter time for the ACT, you know, more on the surface. SAT, fewer problems, sort of, more time, much more in depth, much more complex. Reading is a little different, right? So reading, you still have that sort of multi-step process in the reading. You might need to draw several conclusions to come to the right answer. You might need to, you know, infer complex relationships, you know, connect multiple questions together. The ACT, though, right, is much more just sort of recall, right? Find the information in the passage, understand the sequences, some basic comparisons, cause, effect, but it's much more straightforward. It's much more in the passage. Now, both of them have what are called paired passages, two passages that often have comparison questions between the two. But that is where the ACT stops. The ACT stops at that comparison of questions, versus the SAT brings in graphics. There are natural science sections in the SAT, and in each of those natural science sections have graphs and charts that you have to connect information from the graph to the words on the page, right? So you're going to get a question like this, right? You're going to get a graph, and this is from a reading passage, right? And it's a data analysis question. It's almost a math question or a science question in the middle of the reading section, right? And you have to sort of, you're going to get questions that say, okay, according to the graph and the information in the passage, which one of the following is true, right? And you're going to have to take information from the passage and then connect it to stuff that you read in the graph, and again, stuff that you read in the passage. And that is unique to the SAT. Now, the other thing that I was thinking, I said we were going to talk about this, right, is that there are paired questions, right? ACT has paired passages, the SAT has paired questions, questions that actually require you to connect the answers of two questions together, which means, yes, if you get one wrong, if you get question number 38 wrong, there's a much larger chance that you're going to get question 39 wrong. Now, I have seen students who have gotten the sort of leading question wrong and then the evidence question right because they were looking at the right thing, but they sort of made a wrong conclusion, right? So as long as you're looking at the right part of the passage to get your answer, even if you make a wrong conclusion, you could still get, you know, the follow-up question right. But they are paired, and so, you know, if you get one wrong, there is a larger chance that you're going to be getting the other one wrong as well. And this, you know, again, that goes back to that sort of multi-step complex thinking involved in the SAT, where again, the ACT is a lot more straightforward, but it is faster. I cannot stress that it is one of the most difficult parts of the ACT, is that it is a faster test, right? You have under a minute per question, 53 seconds per question. That is fast. right? That means you have to read the passage very, very quickly and answer the questions relatively quickly as well. The SAT, otherwise, they're fundamentally similar, right? ACT is a bit more pacing, SAT is a bit more complex. Again, it has those graphs, charts, tabled, paired questions, but overall, they're fundamentally similar once you get past that pacing. Now, the writing, very similar in that sense, right? Punctuation, edit challenging sentences, improve organization, ideas, development, impact. They look almost identical, right? They look pretty much identical, based on this page, right? Almost everything's the same from the left side to the right side. And in many ways, that's true. But again, the SAT brings on the chart, right? It brings on those charts. It's going to ask you, especially for those questions that talk about organization or improving the focus of paragraphs, they may ask you to say, hey, based on the graphic, how should you edit this sentence? How should you change this sentence to better connect to the information in the graph? And sometimes those are really challenging questions, and those are, again, only on the SAT. Now, the ACT, again, is faster, right? Again, you have 36 seconds per question compared to the 48. And again, the ACT is really more of an English test. Why? Because it focuses a bit more on the grammar versus the SAT is a writing test. It has a little bit more focus on rhetoric. It's not that large of a difference. We're talking maybe about 5% of the test difference. But again, SAT includes charts, graphs, tabled, a lot of sort of connected questions. You'll get a couple, sometimes like a question that will connect to like, a block question, question 15 to 17, talk about information from the passage. You'll get those kind of paired questions on the SAT that you don't get so much on the ACT, right? Every question is sort of isolated. But, overall, that can be a large difference between the two tests, right? That could be a lot of time that you are looking and comparing those two, right? Very similar, but again, the pacing is a huge difference. Now, science. Let's talk about science. Again, we sort of say that there is really a science section on the ACT, but the SAT, we've talked about graphs and charts in the reading and the writing. Obviously, they're on the math. The SAT integrates a lot of the same skills, a lot of the same ideas that are on the ACT science throughout the other three tests. They're on the math test, they're on the reading test, they're on the writing test. Now, the way in which they use them are slightly different, right? They're understanding you're connecting it to texts to be consistent with data, right? Synthesizing information, connecting, again, data from the graph to the text and vice versa, solving basic problems versus the ACT is a little bit more sort of understanding the basic features related to data summaries, conflicting viewpoints, research. There is no knowledge of biology, chemistry, or physics on the ACT. You don't need to know, what Newton's laws are or the steps of mitosis. Those aren't tested on the ACT. So when we say it's a science test, it's really more about, again, recognizing, understanding concepts in data summaries, in, how to read the results of scientific data, right? The relationships between the hypothesis and the conclusions, generalized information, again, connect to graphs and charts, etc. Now the ACT breaks that down to sort of three types of questions, right? They have data representation, they have research summary, they have these conflicting viewpoints. Data representation is probably the most straightforward, right? It is, you have graphs and charts and you just have to read and interpret the information on the chart, right? Now, sometimes that might mean connecting two charts together in the data in that. But, overall, it's just sort of this overview of, hey, can you read this graph and chart, right? Where they're talking about the force and the mass and, determine some information, right? The relationship based on that the fact that as one goes up, so does the other. And so, that is your data representation. Very straightforward, very simple. Your research summary is a little different. They'll give you multiple related experiments. They'll have study 1 or experiment 1, study 2, experiment 2, and they will ask you to connect, interpret the designs and the results. This is where you might get questions about like the control or the independent variable or the dependent variable of a scientific experiment, right? They want you to sort of understand, hey, is something missing from this research experiment, right? Can the scientist make a hypothesis given this piece of information? Those are your research summary type questions, right? They're a little bit more sort of macroscopic, but they're again based around basic scientific principles. Again, nothing particular. You don't need to know, anything about biology and bacteria to answer the questions that are to be connected to these studies. Now, the conflicting viewpoint. The conflicting viewpoint is almost like a reading question, right? They give related hypotheses, they give related viewpoints that are different. They're, inconsistent with each other. They have different opinions, and then they ask you to compare the viewpoints, the hypothesis. They ask you that, hey, if you found this piece of information, what does it do? Does it strengthen, hypothesis 1 and weaken hypothesis 2, or vice versa? It asks you again to sort of understand how those hypotheses work to each other. It can be very challenging, mainly because it is a lot of reading for the amount of time. Again, pacing is key. So when you look at the SAT and the ACT, yes, the ACT tests the science directly. There is a science section. They don't put charts and graphs in the reading, in the writing. But the SAT, while it doesn't directly test science, there are 2 natural science passages in the reading. There's at least 1 natural science passage in the writing, all of which contains those charts and graphs. It sprinkles the scientific context throughout. In fact, they even have a cross-test score that they call analysis of science, where they take all the questions that are science related and they then give you a score from 10 to 40 on how you did on those questions. Now, it's not in that big 1600 score, right? So it doesn't, connect to that overall grade, but it is, sprinkled throughout so much so that they had to draw attention to it. So just like before, right, no science knowledge is needed in terms of, again, like details about biochemistry, physics. But again, on the ACT, some basic knowledge of about like how to set up an experiment, what the major parts, control, independent, dependent variable, scientific method, hypothesis, research, conclusion. It's based more around those skills than it is based around any actual remembered knowledge from your science classes in high school. So if you're freaking out because there's an ACT science section, don't freak out, right? It's not, and you're like, oh no, it's got science. I don't remember anything from freshman year bio. It's okay. That's not what they're going to be testing you on. Now, the essay. Essay is one of the biggest differences between the two. Both of them are optional. What that means is very few schools require it. In fact, the only really sort of major school system that requires it still is University of California. But many schools accept it and therefore consider it or recommend it. If you see any word that starts with an R, require or recommend, that really means you should do it, because your competition is probably going to be doing it, right? You need to find ways to sort of step ahead or at least stay abreast of the competition. So if something's recommending it, right? Like if your doctor says, hey, so you don't get cancer, I recommend you do X, Y, Z. A lot of people are probably going to do what the doctor recommends. It's the same kind of thing here. If you want that good chance of sort of getting that result that you want, do what the schools recommend. And therefore, we strongly encourage that every student write the essay if they are looking at any school that requires, recommends, or even considers it, right? Because it's just going to help. It's not going to hurt. Most competitive schools, most competitive students applying to those schools are also going to be submitting the essay scores. Again, you don't want to be behind the 8 ball when it comes to applying to those top tier, to your dream schools. You want to make sure that you are in the best possible condition, best possible place when it comes to that, to college application time, and when it comes to decision time, whether it be for early decision, regular decision, or early action. You want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward. And so if the school requires or recommends it, we strongly, strongly recommend that you do it. Now, let's take a look at the actual SAT. SAT versus ACT. SAT is very much about understanding the source text. It is analyzing a text and writing an essay basically talking about how the author supports his argument. Right? It's not about your own opinion. It's not persuasive. It's just about, it's an analytical piece, really sort of looking at you to sort of effectively use evidence from the passage, effectively use good language, versus the ACT. They want you to, they give you these 3 perspectives, and they want you to provide your own position and talk about how it relates to those perspectives. They want you to, it's a persuasive essay, right? They want you to sort of prove your point. But again, they do want you to write cohesively, to demonstrate good use of language and a strong command of evidence, etc. as well. Now, the SAT essay, as I said before, you will get a source text, and the question is the same for every single essay. Read the passage below and analyze how the author uses evidence, reasoning, persuasive language to support their point of view and their argument. It is not about whether you agree or disagree. I cannot stress this enough. If you write an essay about whether you agree or disagree with the author, that will lose you points. Make sure you were talking about how the author builds their argument to persuade their audience, not whether you agree or disagree to it. Now, the ACT essay, again, gives you 3 perspectives. And the question is also, again, very similar with minor differences, right? They want you to write an essay where you evaluate the multiple perspectives on a particular topic. And usually it's topic in current events. This is, dealing with like public health, individual freedom. Sometimes they will deal with, more sort of prevalent topics in terms of, current events going on. But regardless, they want you to analyze the perspectives that are given, right? Analyze and evaluate the perspectives given. You want to analyze and evaluate as much of those perspectives given. And more importantly, have your own perspective. Now, your perspective can agree with 1, 2, none, or all of the perspectives, right? You can have one that is completely separate from these perspectives. You can have one that agrees with every one of them. That's usually a bit hard because some of them are kind of, counter to each other. And then they want you to explain the relationships between your perspectives and one or more of those given, right? They say 1 or more, but really the best essays are going to be talking about all 3 perspectives, right? Never settle for the bare minimum, right? Now, again, as I say, right, your perspective can be a full agreement, partial agreement, no agreement, whatever it is, you need to support your idea. That is the primary purpose of this essay, is to put forth your idea and support it with logical reasoning, detailed persuasive examples while connecting it to the perspectives that they give you. It is not to analyze perspectives first, then write about what you think second. No. Primary concern is making sure that you are writing and putting forth your own perspective and analyzing the perspectives secondary. Okay. A lot of students will spend, paragraphs talking about their perspectives and just sort of have this conclusion follow-up at the end where they just talk about their point of view. That is not what the question asks. You're going to lose points. It is first and foremost a persuasive essay. So when you look at them, right, they are very, very different. This is one of the biggest differences. This and the math are one of the biggest differences when it comes to the SAT versus the ACT. SAT requires students to read, analyze the passage, and then focus on that analysis. It is analytical first, not persuasive. The ACT is persuasive first, analytical second, right? It requires you to examine those 3 perspectives and then present your own and support your own perspective based on those, right? But again, ACT is persuasive, SAT is analytical. The SAT also connects to a lot of the AP Lang, a lot of the skills talked about in AP language and composition. In fact, the essay itself is very similar to one of the free response questions on the AP language test. So if you need extra practice or want to take a look, you can obviously do that. Now, how do we figure out which test is right for you, right? The big question, the reason why most of you are here. How do we determine what test is right for you? Now, the first thing to do is to sort of think about what the differences are, because there aren't that many, right? The reading and writing tests are basically the same, right? Well, yeah, there's a science section on the ACT, but again, analysis, charts, graphs, tables, which is what a lot of the science section is on both tests, right? SAT, it's throughout the whole test, some passages, some math. ACT puts it all one section, as well as obviously a couple in the math section, right? These are in a sense fundamental similarities between them. So these are not what you should be using to make your opinion. These are not necessarily the areas that you should be focusing on when it comes to making that opinion. What you should instead be focusing on are the major differences, right? 1, SAT. Fewer concepts, more deeply. If you're someone who really likes to think through things, you like to make sure and double check your work, SAT is sometimes a little bit more geared to that, right? ACT, more concepts, less deeply, faster paced. Math, right? Pre-calculus versus ACT Algebra 2 Trig. So if that's going to be an issue in terms of your math level, where you're going to be, that's something to think about. Now, that's not the end all be all, right? I know many students who have picked up the material that's learned, in that pre-calculus section for the SAT and done very well on it. The other thing is, again, the SAT has a no calculator section. If you are someone who depends on your calculator for schoolwork and all that kind of stuff, that could be a little bit of an issue. Now, again, science, right, sprinkles it throughout the test, but not specifically on a dedicated section like on the ACT. Now, essay, right? Essay is the big one. If you like one essay better than the other, that might be something to gear. Again, the SAT is analysis. It's asking you to analyze an argument. ACT is a persuasive prompt. You are putting forth your own. So if you don't like, making people believe what you believe, SAT has an essay that's a bit more up your alley. And I always used to say this, the SAT is a marathon. It is a long slog. You have more time per question. The pacing is slower. You want to make sure you're taking your time, you're being thorough, dedicated, investigative, so on and so forth, that you are taking more time per question. It's a marathon. Versus the ACT is like 4 short sprints. You've got to be full pace the whole time, all the way through, from beginning to end, because you don't have a lot of time per question. It is one of the biggest differences. It is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the ACT, is that pacing. So the good news, no matter which test you take, every college accepts both. Colleges do not have a preference. There are a lot of myths going around. I've had a lot of students say, oh, well, I've heard that colleges here want this and colleges in this area of the country want that. No, not anymore. In fact, recently College Board and ACT worked together to come up with a concordance table. They came up with a table where they agreed that an SAT score of blank connects to an ACT score of blank, right? It was an agreement. And colleges have that concordance table. You can go into Google, type in SAT, ACT concordance table into a Google search, and it will be the first link that pops up, and you can see how the comparisons are. Right? So scores are easily converted and compared between the two. So if you take an SAT and you're applying to a school, with a bunch of ACT people, the college can compare the two, and vice versa. So do not feel bad about submitting one test to the other. Your goal is to submit the test that you get the highest possible score, regardless of your personal preference. I know a lot of students, especially based on certain regional or things that they've been sort of told by their friends, that prefer one test because they've been told one thing or another, or because they don't like rushing on the ACT, but they score better on that test. And if they're scoring better, that's what they should be taking. You should always be taking the test that is most beneficial for you, not necessarily the one that you like the best. Now, therefore, the best thing and the number one suggestion that I and pretty much everybody else that you'll run into, take practice tests on both. Go to testing events, come to C2, go through, again, like Khan Academy has a whole bunch of released College Board tests. Take a practice test on both and compare. See which one you do better in, because again, that is the part that you should be focusing on, not necessarily which test you like better. So let's take a look at what that means, right? In a sense, you're going to deal with this rubric, which is if you are, obviously the easy one is that if you are higher in one and you prefer it, take it. If you're higher in one and don't care either way, take the one you do better in. Okay, right? So if you're more comfortable with the SAT, you score better, or you're about the same, do the SAT. If you score better on the ACT and you don't care, or you're more comfortable with the ACT, take the ACT. The real question is that sort of the area in between, right? The sort of one where you score higher in one, but you prefer the other, right? Now, those are the real sort of challenges, right? Because those are the ones where it's all about the amount of time you have left, right? How much time do you have until you have to take this test? Now, if you score higher on the ACT or on the SAT and there is no time, okay, and there is no time, let's say you're taking, a test in a month or less, or in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, or like you have to register for the the test in a week, right? Because remember, the registration deadlines are there too. If there is no time before your registration or before the time you actually take the test, always prepare for whichever one you score higher. So if you score higher in the SAT, even if you like the ACT better, prepare for the SAT. If you score better in the ACT, even if you like the SAT, prepare for the ACT. Now, if you're about the same and you don't care either way, right? If you don't care, which one you go, again, think about, that's where it sort of becomes a little tricky. And again, if you have a short amount of time, think about what you have more options, right? If you have a short amount of time, and that could be before you have to start applying for college or anything like that. If you have a short amount of time, think about how many more test dates are there left, right? Which one will I get more chances on? Which one will give me more prep time? Maybe not for this test, but for the test after that, right? If you're taking, an ACT in a month, but the next ACT is the month after that compared to the SAT, you have 2 months, maybe go with the SAT, right? Because you got a little bit more time to prepare after that first test, right? Think about, again, the deadlines, right? How many tests can you take before you have to apply to college, right? That's all what you should be doing if you are rushed, if there is no time. But if there is time, right? If there is time, that's when your preference becomes possible a bit more of an option, right? If there is time and you like the SAT, and when I mean is time, I'm talking months, not weeks. I'm talking if you have 3, 6, or more months before you can prepare for, or you have to take the test. If there is that time, start preparing for the SAT. Start preparing for the ACT if that's what you like better. Start preparing for whichever test you're more comfortable with, because sometimes for many students, the ceiling is higher when it comes to what they're more comfortable with, right? They might be able to score better on a particular test at this particular moment, but they will be able to score with a lot more time, overall infinitely higher, and just, again, be more comfortable. And comfort is important when you're taking these tests. They are long tests. You want to make sure you're happy and comfortable with the test. So if there is the time, if you have 6 months or a year, prepare for the one you're more comfortable with, but be prepared to flip back to the one that you do better in, at a moment's notice, right? If maybe that improvement's not there, or maybe, you're getting burned out, or you're not, again, not improving, or the time starts to shrink, right? Be prepared to sort of flip back to the one that you do better in. So when it comes down to which test, a lot of it comes down to sort of, looking at, again, what you do better in, what you prefer, and really sort of comparing the two from here. Now, regardless of what happens, one suggestion, which is to prep for one, be ready for both, right? Pick one as your primary choice and focus on it, right? So if you like the SAT, focus for the SAT. Use those test dates, use that essay, prepare for that math, right? Practice with those. But realize that, again, there are a lot of similarities between these two tests, right? There are a lot of similarities between the tests, right? There's connections, there's, the reading, the writing, even the science, right? There's a lot of similarities between the two tests. And so you can, in a sense, stay ready for both tests. You can prepare, you can supplement the tests with the other one, right? So if you're using SAT, feel free to pull in some ACT questions. Feel free to pull in, some ACT reading or some ACT English or even some ACT math, because content is content, right? Math is math, right? A problem on percents is a problem on percents. Doesn't matter whether it's on the SAT or the ACT, you're still learning percents. And so, they overlap a lot. There's a lot of connection between the two. It gives you additional testing options, right? Especially we were talking about before, right? Being prepared if you're more comfortable with one, but do score higher in the other, that you're going to be able to change back right away, really quickly. If you sort of prepare and supplement with the other topic, or the other test, it will allow you to sort of preserve and still improve with the ACT. So it's not like, oh, I'm preparing for the SAT, my ACT score is going to drop. That's not the case. And the other reason, one of the big ones, is a lot of times, especially if you have a long period of time, right? If you're in one of those two boxes, right, where you score higher when you prefer the other, and you have that time, and you're trying for the one that you prefer, right? A lot of times, one of the reasons why people no longer prefer a particular test is, they get burned out on it, right? They've been practicing it for 6, 7, 8, 9 months, a year, and it's like, they're tired of it. They're tired of doing the same type of question over and over again. And so bringing in other tests, trying to practice section of other tests, speeding it up or slowing it down, it can break up the monotony. It can break up that sort of, oh, I'm just doing SAT stuff. Use some ACT, use some extra practice, and, realize that, like, doing that, especially if you have like ACT going into SAT, that you're not going to miss concept, skills, idea that, appear on one but not the other, or that maybe appear with greater frequency on one test and not the other. A classic example of this is geometry, right? Geometry is tested a little bit more on the ACT than on the SAT. So still tested on the SAT. And again, it does make sure that, like, again, if you have to switch back or just to, make sure that you get better on the SAT, like if you take some ACT geometry problems, right, that will also help with the SAT. It'll ensure that you don't miss those concepts if you do need to switch back. It'll ensure that, again, you get that review, some fundamental, maybe some additional practice if maybe what you're using doesn't have a lot of practice on a particular topic, right? It can give you, again, more supplemental additional practice for that. So always make sure, no matter what you're preparing for, that you are still pulling and practicing questions and topics and ideas from both tests, right? Be ready, prep for one, but be ready for both. Supplement, study, take practice, take test material from both tests to prepare. Now, if you're still confused, right, or if you're not entirely sure where to go from here, feel free to come to us, right? We, spend a lot of time, really breaking down. We have practice tests in both of these. If you want to come take a practice test in the SAT, take a practice test in the ACT, compare your scores. Our center directors are phenomenal at really sort of navigating the nuances in each particular student's choice, right? Some students, right, based on preferences in math and English, maybe one test is better for them than that, right? Every case is somewhat unique. And so, if you feel like you don't entirely fit into any one sort of bucket I've talked about today, feel free to come in. Feel free to come in, even if you just have additional questions, you want to have a conversation with the center director. Feel free to give us a call or come. Now, after I'm done, I am going to. There will be a survey that will pop up if you have any other questions, or if you would like to be contacted by a local C2, either to come in, take those practice tests, get that sort of comparison between, meet with the center director so that they can help you work through your particular question, whether which test is better for you, or again, just if you have any additional questions that you have, please make sure to fill out the survey once this is over with. There'll be sort of 3 questions. One's asking for your name. Please put your first name and your last name, a phone number or email address so that we can contact you, reach out to you, as well as a zip code. Please make sure you have the zip code so I can connect you with the center that is closest to you, right? I don't want to connect you with the center that is 1,000 miles away. I want to connect one that is nice, easy, close, to you. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. For all those of you who are taking the test in the upcoming time period, or are going in to take a practice test, or even taking the first official, I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you so much for listening. I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you so much, and good night.